I've been here before quite recently. I think of Jamie Kabler as the mafia. You know that scene in Godfather 3? Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. Anyway, Jamie, thank you so much. Helene, thank you. I want to thank the entire team that has worked to put this incredible event together. This is my fourth. It gets better each time. I also want to say a special word for the angels in this room. It's because you have succeeded so well in your businesses and in your professions that you are able to be so generous in your philanthropy. And that means that those of us who do nothing except produce words for a living can enjoy extraordinary occasions like this one. So really, from the bottom of my heart, and I know I speak for all the writers here, thanks again for putting this together. I was thinking when as I was preparing these remarks, this is the fourth time I've spoken from this stage. The first time I was here in 2015, I spoke about the state of the world. The next time that I was here, I spoke about the state of the nation. In particular, I talked about the state of our souls when it came to the subject of immigration. I've spoken about the state of liberalism and free speech in the United States. And so today, my theme is the state of conservatism. Specifically, what does it mean to be a conservative in the United States in 2019? And believe me, this is a subject I give a great deal of thought to because when I was writing for the Wall Street Journal, particularly my last year there, one segment of reader commentary was that I was actually a crazy liberal leftist, and then no sooner did I move to the New York Times that I became a fascist pig. So somewhere in the middle there is something like what I would think of as the conservative movement, and I think it's worth spending a few minutes talking about it. I came of age in the 1980s when mainstream conservatives believed that the Cold War could be won, that immigration was a net positive for society, that protectionism was bad, that the truth was not relative, that moral character mattered, particularly in our leaders, and that we had a right to expect that those leaders would meet baseline expectations for honesty, temperament, decorum, knowledgeability, prudence, and wisdom. To be a conservative, it meant that your political heroes weren't just Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but also Lech Walesa and Andrei Sakharov, and my friend Garry Kasparov, who's probably here somewhere in this audience and will be on the stage with me a little later. These were the people who were fighting against walls, not for them. To be a conservative, it meant that you believed in an epistemology that was based on facts, reason, and experience, not alternative facts, emotions, and cliques. To be a conservative, you believed in a government that lived within its means. To be a conservative, it meant that you religiously read the columns and essays of Charles Krauthammer, George Will, Bill Buckley, Norman Podhoretz, and Irving Kristol, and it meant that their philosophical lodestars were your own: John Locke and Adam Smith, Jefferson and Burke, de Tocqueville and Lincoln, Karl Popper and Friedrich Hayek. To be a conservative, it meant that you believed in the ideals of a free world and the open society, the dignity of the individual, the rights of mankind, the importance and necessity of dissent, the benefits of economic exchange, and that included the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor. By the end of the decade, with the Berlin Wall down and the US economy roaring, it was easy to see why conservatives could claim vindication. It's what attracted me as a politically minded teenager to their banner. Today, my 3 children are the ages I was in the 1980s. What, from an American perspective, is conservatism to them? Here's what. Number 1, a compulsively dishonest president with an instinct for bullying those who serve him and demeaning those who don't. A belief that political compromise is a sign of weakness, not confidence. Attacks on the probity and patriotism of our security establishment, the likes of which has not been seen since the time of Joe McCarthy. A $1 trillion fiscal deficit. A slogan, America First, taken directly from the isolationist and anti-Semitic movement that predated U.S. entry into World War II. The demonization of immigrants, particularly those from S-hole countries, whether in Latin America, Africa, or the Middle East, as if our own ancestors arrived in the United States speaking mellifluous English and wearing Burberry coats. A gun culture that refuses to set any limits on itself and every year leads to the deaths of 16,000 people, not including suicides. Rallies in which the president's supporters rage against the news media as, quote, an enemy of the American people, term borrowed, by the way, directly from Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. A conservative news channel whose leading lights, Sean Hannity, Jeanine Pirro, and Laura Ingraham, don't bother to disguise the fact that they are mouthpieces for the president himself. Trade wars with our immediate neighbors, temper tantrums against our historic allies, the cruel separation of families through forced deportations, and an obsession with a border wall that is never going to be built and Mexicans are never going to pay for, but for which millions of Americans have already paid dearly. This is the short list, but it's enough to ensure that my children won't soon become Republicans, at least not until something changes. And it's hard for me to fault them. But it's also a shame, and perhaps a tragedy, because no democracy can remain healthy for long without a morally sound and intellectually serious conservative movement. Right now, the United States does not have one, and it is unlikely to recover it anytime soon. In place of a politics in which the fringes bend toward the center, we get a politics in which the center bends toward the fringe. This is how democracies perish. What then should conservatism be about? By definition, conservatism in any country or culture is the politics of order, tradition, and caution. Conservatives do not have to be reflexively hostile to change, but they believe in slow rolling it, not speeding it up, in carefully measuring the risks of unintended consequences before embracing change, and for cherishing established social norms because for all their faults and prejudices, they are not easily replaced and represent the accumulated wisdom of generations. But if that's a generic description of conservatism in any society or any country, what about conservatism in the United States? Is it the same thing? It is not. Unlike, say, Japan or Russia, America was not founded on the basis of ethnicity, language, or geography. Our bonds as a nation are not of blood. We do not have a common religious tradition. In many ways, we don't have a common culture either, at least in the way that, say, Greeks or Koreans do. We are Americans because we participate in a common system and because we subscribe to a common set of ideals. These ideals are, in the classical sense of the word, liberal. We believe in unalienable rights, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of prosperity in free markets, and we believe in representative government. That means there is a paradox at the heart of American conservatism. It does not exist to counter liberalism in the original sense of that word, much less to repudiate it. Conservatism exists to protect liberalism. The intelligent conservative addresses the paradox by advocating a politics of liberal ends and conservative means. What are the ends? The ends are the right of the individual to enjoy the greatest degree of personal liberty compatible with the rights of his or her neighbor. The means are the institutions, family, church, civic associations, schools, businesses, the military, the free market itself, that help produce citizens capable of responsible and enlightened self-government. To argue for conservatism for its own sake is foolish. Its purpose is to give men and women the moral and intellectual wherewithal to take full advantage of their birthright as free people. This is also to say that intelligent conservatives appreciate, better sometimes than their left-wing peers do, the fragility of the liberal order. Liberal democracies do not run themselves like a self-winding watch. They are not immune from the consequences of their own bad choices. And sometimes those choices, just think of Brexit, can be disastrous and potentially irrevocable. They are also far more vulnerable to neglect, decay, subversion, or overthrow than many of us would care to believe. Look at Venezuela, or, for that matter, Hungary and Poland. Above all, free societies have enemies, the forces of revolution and reaction, of left and right-wing populism, of utopia and tribe. The core conservative task is to protect liberalism from those enemies, even if it sometimes means protecting liberals, at least heedless liberals, from themselves. In the 1970s and 1980s, it was not hard to know who the enemy was, what he did, or the things for which he stood. One simply needed to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn or Vladimir Bukovsky, or follow the news from the Solidarity movement in Poland. Progressives may have taken a more indulgent view of the so-called people's republics, but conservatives did not. In the 1990s, it was not hard to know, as political correctness and identity politics came into vogue on college campuses, that liberalism could not thrive if speech was not truly free, and if the ties of common citizenship took second place to racial or ethnic or religious affinities. And after the attacks of September 11, 2001, the enemy was also clear, not just in the form of Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network, but also in the broader Islamist movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and so on, from which Al-Qaeda, at least philosophically, had emerged. These enemies came either from the left or from the outside. What about the enemies on the right, especially the domestic ones? For many years, I was convinced that the mainstream of the American conservative movement had banished most of the bigots in its midst. Starting in the 1950s, Bill Buckley, the godfather of modern American conservatism, forbade anti-Semites from being published in the pages of his magazine, National Review. And over time, the same thing was done to segregationists, conspiracy theory kooks, John Birchers, and so on. By the time I began working for the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal in the 1990s, I was sure the process of what in Eastern Europe used to be called lustration was complete. Sure, there was Pat Buchanan, and the party definitely wasn't where it needed to be on gay rights, and still isn't. But on the whole, the leading figures of the right all seem to me to be basically on the right side of history and operating within the framework of political decency. My optimism turned out to be totally premature. Advocates of the closed society have made a roaring comeback with demagogic attacks on free trade and immigration from Latin America, falsely claiming that both are to blame for the struggles of the American working class. From that premise, it's a short hop to denunciations of globalism and the deep state, the sinister conspiracies of within and without that now routinely issue from the White House and its allies in the media. What we have now is a kind of framework of anti-Semitism, that is, fear of a shadowy conspiracy being organized by nefarious rich people with no sense of loyalty to this country, without yet a specifically Jewish target. But mark my words, that will not be far behind. Here again, it should have been the task of leading conservative thinkers to point out the foulness and danger of this and to denounce it. But after capturing the Republican nomination and then the presidency, Trump also captured most of the conservative intelligentsia. Suddenly, the same columnists, some of whom I had worked alongside with for a long time, who had spent 20 or 30 years of their careers writing earnest denunciations of the moral degradation of the political left, found complete comfort with a president who consorts with porn stars. Just think of Bill Bennett, author of that timeless 1990s classic, The Death of Outrage, with respect to Monica Lewinsky and President Clinton. These same conservatives had, until just a few years ago, denounced the Obama administration for its softness on the Putin regime. Again, just think of the fury on the right when President Obama told Dmitry Medvedev at a summit in Asia in 2012 that he'd have, quote, more flexibility to negotiate another arms control agreement after the 2012 election. Yet by the time that President Trump was in the Oval Office, we suddenly discovered that these same conservatives were arguing for, quote, pragmatism with the Russian dictator. Or consider the example of John Bolton. Nobody I know was more publicly and repeatedly outspoken than John about the need to forcefully confront the menace of North Korea. In the Obama years, when he was out of government, and before he became Trump's national security advisor, he wrote one op-ed after another in the Wall Street Journal, rightly warning against the siren song of negotiations with Pyongyang, because you could always rely on the Kim family to renege and to cheat. So what has National Security Advisor John Bolton been up to recently? Well, he's arranging a second summit between President Trump and his best pen pal, Kim Jong-un. The capitulation of so many conservative figures to Trumpism is, in my mind, probably the most dangerous aspect of the Trump phenomenon, far more dangerous than the impulsive president himself or the policies that he's enacted. Why? Because it means that Trump and the style of politics he represents isn't just a personal phenomenon that will pass as soon as he has left the stage. It means instead that the people who were supposed to guard the conservative movement against the barbarians at the gate have chosen to lower the drawbridge and join the wrong side. It means that the liberal order, already under siege from the new champions of illiberalism, has lost a vital element of its defense and perpetuation. This is, in some ways, what happened in the 1920s in the period that the French writer Julien Benda called the treason of the intellectuals, by which he meant those writers who had given themselves over to the politics of ultranationalism, nationalism, and fascism, then being represented by the Mussolini regime in Italy. Benda excoriated these thinkers for, and I quote, the intellectual organization of political hatreds. He condemned them for worshiping, again, quote, the cult of success, and warned against their desire, quote, to abase the values of knowledge before the values of action. He predicted that their behavior had put mankind on the road, quote, to the greatest and most perfect war the world has ever seen. Now, I do not want to accuse today's pro-Trump intellectuals of being quasi-fascists. With a handful of exceptions, they're not, but they're guilty of three dangerous follies. First of all, they are sacrificing the long-term reputation of the conservative movement for the sake of short-term policy gains. 10 or 20 or 50 years from now, nobody is going to remember whether the corporate tax rate stood at 35, 30, or 20%. But they will remember that a Republican president and large segments of his base decided to vilify Hispanics, the fastest growing ethnic demographic in the United States, as criminals and job stealers. In other words, they are doing to the Republican Party on a national level what Prop 187 did to Republicans at the California state level, that is, rendering it nearly unelectable. Second, they are adopting the themes of the European nationalist right, which is fascist in its tendencies. If you want to know where the politics of demonizing the free press, attacking immigrants, sympathizing with Putin, and turning George Soros into an object of 1984 Orwell-style 2 minutes of hate, visit Budapest, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban is pioneering a form of politics he openly calls, quote, a liberal democracy. Many conservatives I know who reluctantly support Trump dismiss him as a kind of useful clown. But they should ask themselves what happens when we get Trump 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0 and so on. That is, smarter, smoother, more Machiavellian Trump. That is when we're going to be in much more serious trouble. Finally, Trumpian intellectuals have abandoned the defense of liberty against its enemies. Who will make the case for free speech when it is under attack by Islamists, Putinists, Trumpists, as well as an increasingly vocal corner of the left that champions speech codes on college and corporate campuses? Who will stand up for the free market if it too is under siege from the Steve Bannon protectionists on the right and the Bernie Sanders socialists on the left? Who still believes in an ideal of a free world bound above all by a shared commitment to liberal principles that should unite democracies the world over against their dictatorial foes? In the United States, the handful of conservative thinkers who make the case for this sort of liberalism are called never-Trumpers. Collectively, we could probably fit inside a bus. A great many of us are Jewish. This is almost surely not an accident. We know from family histories where the politics of demagogic nativism tend to lead. The term never-Trumper is something of a misnomer because there are times when we have found ourselves in agreement with the administration. For the record, and to the consternation of many readers of the Times and probably many of you, I supported Brett Kavanaugh's nomination. I supported the decision to withdraw from the Iran deal. I admire the stand the administration is taking against the Maduro dictatorship in Venezuela, and I'm grateful that we have a thriving economy, partly due to the administration's useful efforts to roll up and do away with anti-business regulations. As a right-of-center columnist, I try to call them as I see them and not let my deep personal distaste for the president get in the way of policy judgments. But I also try to take a longer view. Daniel Patrick Moynihan once made the point that the difference between liberals and conservatives was that liberals believed that politics could save cultures from themselves, while conservatives believed that culture ultimately determined the nature of politics. I'm conservative. I believe that the political culture now being fashioned by Trumpism, the disregard for truth, the assault on institutions, the sympathy for authoritarians, the denigration of the opposition party as an enemy, and the addiction to social media is a cancer on the long-term health of democracy and ruinous for the cause of a morally sound conservatism that all of you, including all of you who are liberals and progressives, ought to treasure. So I'll accept a bit of a semantic imprecision and proudly let myself be called a never-Trumper. Now, at the risk of self-importance, which is never a problem with me, we never-Trumpers are the saving remnant of the conservative cause. That makes it vital that we not lose our way, either by shifting to the left or succumbing to the blandishments of this new old right. Conservatism in the tradition of Burke, Lincoln, and Hayek, of a healthy balance between the claims of tradition, the possibilities of self-improvement, and the necessity of political and economic liberty, these are the essential ingredients in the preservation of a free society. The conservative temperament, at its occasional best, is about refusing to be swept along in the current of things. Now is the time, as Buckley wrote in 1955, to stand athwart history, yelling, "Stop." Can that be done? Right now, never-Trump conservatives have lost not only a political party, but also an institutional base in the form of a major newspaper or a prominent think tank. It might recover if the Trump presidency fails in some spectacular way, like an economic crisis, impeachment, or a calamitous war, but it's not right and it's not smart to bet on such things. one should assume that Trumpism will succeed politically and that Trump is still likely to be reelected as president, particularly if Bob Mueller comes up empty in his investigation and the economy remains strong in 18 months' time. That is to say, the road for political recovery is likely to be a long one, and which is why I've joined forces with the likes of Gary Kasparov, John Meacham, and Ann Applebaum to start the Renew Democracy Initiative, which I hope you'll consider endorsing and maybe even supporting, and which will be the subject of the panel discussion in about half an hour's time. In the meantime, what thoughtful conservatives can do is to reassert the principles, moral and political, for which we must stand. The principles of 1776 and 1989, of Adam Smith and Thomas Jefferson, Václav Havel, and Tiananmen Square's anonymous tank man. Those principles of free markets over the confiscatory state, of the pursuit of happiness over the claims of communal tradition, of independent thinking over the enforced conformity of ideology, and of conscience and courage in the face of the mechanical power of tyrannical regimes are why, even now, we live in a free and prosperous world. Students of American history are familiar with the story of Benjamin Franklin's reply at the close of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 to a woman who asked him, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" To which Franklin immortally replied, "A republic if you can keep it." The task of the true conservative is to keep it. Thank you very much. And now I have some time to take questions, and I need to have a question mark at the end of every question so that I can repeat it for the camera. Yes?
What's the biggest difference between working at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times?
So the question is, what is the big difference between working at the Wall Street Journal, where I spent 16 years of my career, and working at the New York Times, where I'm almost at 2? I think the difference between the two newspapers is kind of like the difference between the Grateful Dead and the Beatles. In the following sense, which is, the Grateful Dead is a cult band. So if you're into it, you're really into it. And you have tie-dye t-shirts that you've maintained without laundering them since 1974. And you've got Jerry Garcia ties and all the rest of it. But if you're not into the Grateful Dead, it's just like this thing that's out there that you're dimly aware of. Whereas the Times, everyone participates in it. I mean, Maureen is John, and I get to be Ringo, but everyone still kind of knows who you are, and it's a very strange experience. I noticed something had changed when I got a hot dog at Grand Central Station, and someone said, "You're Bret Stephens from the Wall Street Journal, from the New York Times, the guy who was selling me the hot dog." And I thought, well, this is kind of odd. So that's the personal difference. I would say this about the two papers. They are both magnificent American journalistic institutions. But when I was at the Journal, I thought they were equivalent institutions. It was only when I came to the Times that I realized the extraordinary global reach of the newspaper. Nothing in the world to this day matches it, and it makes it a privilege to be able to write for it. Sir? Well, this is why, sorry, the question. The question is, who do I, as a sort of middle-of-the-road conservative, who would I throw my weight behind were the election tomorrow between the president and the Democratic candidates who have stepped forward. It reminds me of an exchange in a Woody Allen film, Play It Again, Sam, where Woody approaches this interesting-looking woman at a museum, and he says, "What are you doing Saturday night?" And she says, "Committing suicide." And he says, "How about Friday night?" Look, all I can say is that if the choice ends up being between someone on the hard left and someone and President Trump, that's an excellent reason to really get out of the country for people like me. What I am hoping for is to avert that choice in two ways. Number one, I think that after the shutdown, for the first time, Trump is genuinely vulnerable, and that there might be an opportunity, I wrote about this in a column a couple weeks ago, for someone to challenge him within the Republican Party. And even if that challenge never gets anywhere, it is a valuable thing to do, to say that not every conservative is on board with the drift of the party. And I don't know if it's Larry Hogan from Maryland, very successful centrist governor there, John Kasich, Jeff Flake, or God knows who. There ought to be someone who stands up in the party and says, we are not being represented by a style of politics which is mendacious, opportunistic, and unprincipled. That the conservative movement and the party of Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan is absent in the White House. But let me say this also to the Democrats in the room. You know, now there's a big uproar. Oh my God, Howard Schultz might run as an independent and bleed votes away from the Democratic candidate and deny Democrats the office. Well then, run a centrist candidate. If it's going to be all Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, you're only going to make it more likely that guys like me, and I think many of you who feel utterly disenchanted with the options on the ballot, are going to lean towards a candidate like him. So the Democrats have to remember that they are also the party of Harry Truman and Jack Kennedy and Scoop Jackson, and yes, in important respects, Bill Clinton, who understood that it was important to stand progressively, but at the vital center of American politics, rather than to spin off into a Bernie Sanders socialist delirium in which pigs fly, socialism works. These things don't happen. And so I would only urge everyone among you, whether you're Republican or Democrat, look towards the center, not the fringe of your party. Establish some gravity.
Do you think Trump will exercise a nuclear option and declare a national emergency?
You know, whenever you say, the question was, will Trump exercise a nuclear option and declare a national emergency? You know, in the age of Trump, when you say, will he exercise a nuclear option, it's not purely a metaphorical expression. So you mean a national emergency with respect to building a wall? I don't know. You know, the problem with your question is that it forces me to make a prediction, the value of which you will soon discover. You should ask me about what's going to happen 5 or 10 years in the future when you will have utterly forgotten what I have to say. Look, there are large forces in the party that are urging him not to do it for a very sensible reason, because if you can declare a national emergency over the border, well then President Harris or Warren or whoever it is going to declare a national emergency over, I don't know, climate change or something of the sort, and we're going to end up with far too much executive power, and presidents who feel free for ideological reasons of left or right to deviate from normal politics. So of course I hope he doesn't. Look, I was just in northern Israel. I took a tour of the border between Israel and Lebanon, okay? This is after the DMZ in Korea. This is the most militarily sensitive border in the world. So I drove for several miles right along the border, right along a fence that you would see maybe separating cattle somewhere out in California, but it was an Israeli-style fence, which is called an indicative fence. That is to say, even though I could look at the Hezbollah guy who was as far from me as the two of us are, that's how far we were, this indicative fence was a smart fence. It was studded with technology. There were people monitoring the border on video screens behind it, and Israel is a safe country. So the idea, we do not need a 12th century solution to a 21st century problem. And, you know, more than that, and I've said this before, okay, but it needs to be said again. Okay, I believe we should have borders, right? That's normal. But we should, every single morning, wake up here in California and let us count our blessings that we have Mexico as our neighbor. You know why? I'll tell you why, if you don't agree with me. If you're Israel, Hezbollah is your neighbor. If you're South Korea, Kim Jong-un is your neighbor. If you're Lithuania, Vladimir Putin is your neighbor. Who are our neighbors? There are 90 million or 100 million people who, when they come here, legally or illegally, want nothing more than to participate in an American dream that all of our ancestors wanted to participate in as well. So by all means, we need immigration reform, we need a more regularized system, we need to keep drug dealers and criminal gangs out, okay? But again, remember the blessing of having a country where your neighbors are either Mexico or somewhat more dangerously Canada. Sir in the back in the blue.
I understand your views in supporting Kavanaugh, but how did you wrestle with the concept that supporting Kavanaugh could lead to the undoing of Roe versus Wade?
Yeah, well, the question was my views on Kavanaugh and supporting him, and the question of what it came to with Roe v. Wade. I'm a pro-choice person for the record. When let me make two points. I think there were justifiable philosophical reasons if you were a Democratic senator to oppose Kavanaugh's nomination on principled questions about how he would vote on given subjects that would come before the court, okay? But what I absolutely rejected was the railroading of a candidate based on hearsay evidence that would never stand up in court, and I would extend exactly the same courtesy to a future nominee of a Democratic president about whom charges stretching 30 years back or 35 years back that can't be proven except by our gut sense of what's right or what's true or not holds up. Because if you're a liberal, you believe in the presumption of innocence, particularly, and that's particularly important when you have a gut feeling that someone is guilty. Because when you have a gut feeling that someone is guilty, that's how the Central Park Five end up in jail for crimes they didn't commit. That's why we have a liberal system. Now, to address your particular point, I am old enough to remember that when Justice Kennedy was put on the court, liberals said for a certainty, if Kennedy is nominated, they will overturn Roe v. Wade. And yet the decisive vote in Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which really cemented the right of choice in this country, was given by Justice Kennedy. They did it the same with Justice Souter. When Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, went up for the court, the view was he's a crazy right-wing extremist. Now everyone understands he's actually a pragmatic conservative maintaining the balance of the court. And it is hugely important for the court to have bipartisan legitimacy that qualified candidates, either from Democratic or Republican presidents, be allowed to sit on the court. A balanced court is good for democracy. So unless you have a Roman Hruska issue, that mediocre men should have a right to sit on for little representation on the court, if there is a question of competence, then I think that's a good argument to vote against those candidates. Otherwise, I supported Elena Kagan's nomination, Sonia Sotomayor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Judge Breyer, because all of them are supremely well qualified nominees who represent half of this country and deserve to have their seats. A woman in red. So the question is about anti-Semitism. I made the point that the assault on globalism, international banks, is a recipe for a new anti-Semitism. Your point is that the rise of anti-Israel campus, radical anti-Israel campus activism is leading to the same result, and I agree with you 100%, which is to say that we Jews cannot afford to be blind to the enemies, whether they're on our right or on our left. Anti-Zionism is the modern face of anti-Semitism. And if you'll scratch an anti-Zionist long enough, you'll very quickly discover, unless there's some Meshuggah, rabbis at Muncie, you'll very quickly discover an anti-Semite. I can understand the argument against Israel if you just don't believe in the concept of the nation state. By all means, argue against Israel and then argue against France or argue against Britain or argue against any nation state, because then you're just in favor of a different idea of political organization. But to say that the one state in the world that should be wiped off the map, the one state in the world that has no legitimacy, just happens to be the Jewish state, then I think you're going to have to make a pretty convincing argument to me that you're not an anti-Semite, because to me that's prima facie evidence of it. And I think this needs to be, and I think this is a problem that we have politically today. And I'm saying this to all of you who feel, again, at the center of politics, that you should not feel comfortable with either side. That because we are profoundly and rightfully upset by the Corbynista leftism that is openly or brazenly anti-Semitic, doesn't mean we should be blind to a president of the United States who says, our sovereignty is being undermined by those globalists and the international banks, and they just happen to have names like Blankfein and Soros and Yellen. That needs to worry us equally. People often say, and I'll finish with this point. People say, to be at the center of politics, that's so mushy, right? It's just like, you're a little bit of this, you're a little bit of that, where are your principles and so on. And maybe that was true at some point in history. But I think right now, the most courageous people that I know are trying to stand, whether from a little bit to the left or the right, are trying to stand for the center. Because believe me, when they're attacking you on social media because you're a hopeless leftist or a total fascist, okay, and you're getting it from both ends, it's not pleasant. But it is the right thing to do. All of us came of age in an America that was able to find its balance, was able to find its center. And that is why we have prospered the way we have, why we haven't gone the way of Venezuela or Argentina or so many other failed democracies. You people, I bet, with two exceptions, you people are the center. You are sanity. And you need to express that by knowing that you don't have to take partisan sides. You can stand for a set of principles which are honorably conservative, intelligently progressive, and do so with some conviction, and hopefully, if there are enough of you, you'll find a candidate, and that candidate may one day be the president. Thank you very much.